Chapter 9. Mom is lying. Mom is hurting me. Please call the police. One of the hazards of running a clinic for maltreated and traumatized children is success. If you develop a reputation for being able to help these young people, you will inevitably be unable to keep up with the demand. It can be hard to increase staff and services and still maintain the high-quality, individualized, and time-intensive care the children need. This was why our working group ultimately decided to maximize our ability to get the best care to the most children by focusing on research and training. Our educational efforts target all of the adults who live and work with maltreated children, from psychiatrists to policymakers to police officers and parents. We continue to do clinical work with multiple service partners across the country, but back in 1998 most of this work was based at our large clinic in Houston. James, a 6-year-old boy, became one of our patients. Our work in his case was not therapy. I had been asked to provide expert input on his complex situation. James taught me a great deal about courage and determination, and reminded me how important it is to listen, paying close attention to the children themselves. James was referred to us by a judge who had received so many different opinions about the boy's situation that he hoped we could clarify what was going on. A children's legal advocacy organization was worried that he was being abused by his adoptive parents. Numerous therapists and child protective services, however, believed that he was such a troublemaker that his adoptive family had needed a break from him. Teachers reported unexplained bruises and scratches. The boy had been adopted before his first birthday by a couple who had also taken in 3 other children and had 1 biological child. James was the second oldest. When we met him, his oldest sibling was 8 and the youngest, a girl, was an infant. According to his mother, Merle, James was incorrigible and uncontrollable. He frequently ran away from home, he tried to jump out of moving cars, he attempted suicide and wet his bed. By age 6 he had been hospitalized numerous times, once after jumping from a 2nd-story balcony. He lied constantly, especially about his parents, and seemed to enjoy defying them. He was being prescribed antidepressants and other medications for impulsivity and attention problems. He'd seen numerous therapists, psychiatrists, counselors, and social workers. His mother said he was so unmanageable that she called Child Protective Services on herself, pretending to be a neighbor concerned that his mother could not handle him and that he was a danger to himself and his siblings. The last straw was an overdose of medication he'd taken that had landed him in an intensive care unit. He was so close to death that he had to be flown to the hospital in a helicopter for rapid treatment. Now he'd been taken to a residential treatment center to give his mother a respite. The judge had been asked to determine what should happen next. CPS caseworkers and several therapists believed he had reactive attachment disorder, RAD, a diagnosis frequently given to children who have suffered severe early neglect and/or trauma. Leon, who ultimately killed 2 girls, may have had this disorder. It is marked by a lack of empathy and an inability to connect with others, often accompanied by manipulative and antisocial behavior. RAD can occur when infants don't receive enough rocking, cuddling, and other nurturing physical and emotional attention. The regions of their brains that help them form relationships and decode social cues do not develop properly, and they grow up with faulty relational neurobiology, including an inability to derive pleasure from healthy human interactions. RAD symptoms can include the failure to thrive and stunted growth we saw in Laura's case. The disorder is often seen in people like Laura's mother, Virginia, who was moved to a new foster home every 6 months and not allowed to develop a lasting early attachment with 1 or 2 primary caregivers. Children raised in institutions like orphanages are also at risk, as are children like Justin and Connor. In addition to being unresponsive to people they know, many children with RAD are inappropriately affectionate with strangers. They seem to see people as interchangeable because they were not given the chance to make a primary, lasting connection with a parent or parent substitute from birth. These indiscriminately affectionate behaviors are not really an attempt to connect with others, however, but rather they are more accurately understood as submission behaviors, which send signals to the dominant and powerful adults that you will be obedient, submissive, and no threat. RAD children have learned that affectionate behaviors can neutralize potentially threatening adults, but they don't seem to engage in them as a way to form lasting, emotional ties. Fortunately, RAD is rare. Unfortunately, Many parents and mental health workers have latched onto it as an explanation for a wide range of misbehavior, especially in adopted and foster children. Treatments like holding, which were so harmful to the Gilmer, Texas, children, are pitched as cures for RAD, as are other coercive and potentially abusive treatments that involve emotional attacks and heavy-handed discipline. James's therapist, for example, had recommended that his mother lock him in a closet when his behavior got too wild. The therapist and the mother's description of James's behavior did seem to fit the diagnosis. But there was something decidedly odd about James's records. When he was in the hospital or in a residential treatment center, he was well behaved. He didn't try to run away, didn't threaten suicide. His behavior in school was unremarkable aside from some minor aggression toward other boys. Nothing like the out-of-control demon his mother consistently complained about. And there was something else, too. His adoptive parents' behavior was unusual. They would show up for his appointments with us, he was living in a treatment center at the time, when they had explicitly been told not to do so. One time his father came with a gift for him and waited around for hours. When one of our staff interviewed James's mother, she seemed entirely focused on herself and her own problems, repeatedly expressing her distress about being separated from him, but not any concern about what he might be going through. When I met James, I instantly liked him. He was a bit small for his age, with curly blonde hair. He was engaging, behaved appropriately, and reciprocated eye contact and smiles. In fact, he laughed and joked with me and seemed to like my company. Stephanie, his primary clinician on our interdisciplinary team, felt the same way about him. After 4 sessions, we had planned to stop seeing him because we felt we had enough information for our evaluation. At our clinic, we coordinate and discuss a patient's care in staff meetings, where everyone involved in a particular child's case comes together to staff the child. We thoroughly discuss each person's interactions with the patient and their impressions of him or her. In the staffing for James, Stephanie became emotional. She'd liked the boy and was sad that she wouldn't be working with him anymore. When I saw her near tears, my perspective on the case shifted. If a child has RAD, the lack of connection and attachment goes both ways. There is a reciprocal neurobiology to human relationships. Our mirror neurons create this. As a result, these children are difficult to work with because their lack of interest in other people and their inability to empathize makes them hard to like. Interacting with them feels empty, not engaging. Stephanie shouldn't have been so upset at disconnecting from a child with RAD. There should have been no loss of relational contact to miss. Therapists are as human as anyone else, and the lack of rewarding interactions with RAD children tends to make working with them feel like a burden, not a joy. The anger and despair that their coldness and unpleasant behavior can provoke may be the reason why so many parents are attracted to therapies for it that are harsh and punitive, and why therapists so often converge on these harmful techniques. Most therapists feel relieved if the therapy ends. But James had endeared himself to Stephanie and me, and, as we discussed him, I realized that he could not have genuine RAD. We began to look more closely at his records and at the different versions of the events contained there. That overdose, for example. With a little additional research, we discovered that James had run away from home earlier the same day and had been returned to his mother by sheriff's deputies. Within an hour, according to Merle, he'd taken an overdose of an antidepressant. She called the poison control hotline and operators told her to get the child to the hospital immediately. Inexplicably, Merle hadn't driven to the hospital. Instead, she went to a nearby supermarket, and what should have been a 10-minute drive from her home to that shop somehow took her half an hour. After parking, she ran screaming into the store, seemingly hysterical about her unconscious child. EMS was called. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, paramedics rapidly called in a life flight helicopter to take him to the hospital. Now we learned that medical staff had been suspicious of Merle almost every time she'd had contact with them. As EMS workers fought frantically to stabilize the boy at the market, she'd sat calmly, sipping a soda. Her hysterics and worry about the child mysteriously ended, even though his survival was still far from assured. At the hospital, upon being given the good news that he would pull through, Merle shocked the doctor by asking that the boy be removed from life support. One ER nurse suspected her of tampering with the medical equipment. As soon as he was conscious and his mother was not present, James told hospital staff, Mom is lying. Mom is hurting me. Please call the police. Suddenly, James's behavior made sense to us. There had been numerous aspects of his story that didn't fit, that made no sense in the context of what I knew about child behavior. Over time, one's sense of how certain kinds of youth are likely to behave in certain circumstances becomes intuitive, and, when something doesn't seem right, it's a signal one should give close attention. That's how I knew, for example, that Stephanie and I weren't reacting the way we would if James had really had RAD. Such trained intuition is a large part of what distinguishes experts from amateurs in most fields. We don't always consciously know what it is that doesn't fit, but somewhere our brain recognizes that part of the puzzle is missing, and it sends up a signal that something's askew. This gut feeling is actually a low-level activation of the stress response system, which is acutely attuned to combinations of incoming signals that are out of context or novel. It was clear to me that James had run away because his mother was harming him, not because he was defiantly misbehaving. Running away is uncommon among children his age, even those who are abused. Even the most severely battered and neglected elementary school children tend to fear change and strangeness more than they fear losing the only parents they have ever known. They prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. The younger the child, the more important familiar people and situations usually are. Many such children have begged me to return them to violent and dangerous parents. But James was different. His behavior was that of someone seeking help, not of someone who had difficulty forming attachments and relationships. From this new perspective, I could see that the boy hadn't jumped off the second-floor balcony or tried to leap out of moving cars. He'd been pushed. James hadn't voluntarily swallowed a whole bottle of antidepressants. The overdose had been forced on him. He was not manipulative, nor was he acting out. He was simply trying to get help for himself and his siblings in the only ways he knew how. And he refused to give up, despite being disregarded, ignored, disbelieved, and even punished for telling the truth. Merle had almost succeeded in killing James at least twice. His helicopter ride following the overdose had not been his first experience with life flight transportation. He'd been helicoptered to the hospital following the fall from the second-story balcony as well. James was scheduled to return to her home after the respite care, and worse, his adoptive siblings were, as we sat around discussing the case, still in that dangerous household. I am ordinarily extremely cautious, but I knew once we figured out what had happened that those children were in imminent danger. I contacted the authorities and asked the judge to have CPS remove the other children immediately and seek permanent termination of parental rights. James's case plunged me into the heart of one of the key conflicts in child psychiatry. Although the patient is the child, he is not the one that gets to make most decisions about his care and treatment, and he is often not the person who provides the initial information about the case. We'd been told by Merle that James was sick, but James was sick only because Merle had been making him that way. James's case had been framed as that of a difficult child with behavior problems, but he was really a courageous, persistent, and ethical child who'd been placed in an impossible situation, one in which his every attempt to help himself and his siblings was framed as evidence of his bad behavior. Those of us who work with troubled children have to guard constantly against our preconceptions about a situation. One person's troubled teen may be another person's victim of sexual abuse, and the label given to the child often determines how he is treated. A child seen as bad will be treated differently from one viewed as mad, and both will have their behavior seen in a very different light depending on whether the clinician sees a victim or a perpetrator. Further, depending upon one's point of view, the exact same behavior can be framed as running away or seeking help, and the perspective will profoundly affect decisions about what to do for and to the child. While most parents have their children's best interests at heart, it is also true that disturbed children often have disturbed parents who may be the direct cause of the children's problems. It is a serious challenge to engage the parents and to keep the child in therapy, but to avoid supporting them in ongoing actions that will do him harm. Many children are lost to treatment because the parents are either unwilling or unable to change harmful behavior patterns, and such parents often rapidly become suspicious of any treatment that doesn't place the blame for any difficulties squarely on the child. In James's case, Merle continuously doctor-shopped, seeking professionals who viewed him as a case of reactive attachment disorder, and dropping those who questioned her actions or judgment too closely. She was able to present the opinions of therapists and social workers in support of her case to child welfare authorities, leaving out the views of those who disagreed with the diagnosis. However, to be fair, I should also point out that many parents also do have good reason to avoid stigmatizing, parent-blaming theories of mental illness. Not long ago, schizophrenia was believed to be caused by schizoprenogenic mothers, and autism was blamed on refrigerator moms, mothers who are cold and uncaring. We now know that genetics and biology play the major role in the etiology of those conditions. But abuse and trauma can also produce similar symptoms. As we have seen, children like Connor and Justin, whose problems were solely due to abuse and neglect, are often labeled autistic, schizophrenic, and or brain damaged. Their problems, however, were the result of a damaging environment. It is an ongoing challenge for child psychiatry to distinguish between diseases like schizophrenia and autism and disorders caused by early abuse and neglect. And it is even more difficult to understand and take into account how early childhood trauma can express underlying genetic vulnerabilities. For example, people with genuine schizophrenia are far more likely than others to have a history of childhood abuse or trauma. All complex human conditions, even those that involve a strong genetic component, can also be affected by the environment. The challenge of treating these children and dealing with their parents becomes even more daunting in cases like that of James, in which the parents are deliberately deceptive. Merle would turn out to have a condition called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Munchausen's disorder is named after an 18th-century German baron, Karl Friedrich von Munchausen, who was known for the exuberantly exaggerated tall tales he told. Patients with Munchausen syndrome, usually women, deliberately make themselves ill in order to get medical attention and sympathy from others. They go from doctor to doctor, undergoing unnecessary painful and invasive tests and procedures. In order to produce convincing symptoms, they go to great extremes, contaminating 4 lines with feces to cause infection, for example. In Munchausen's by proxy syndrome, MBPS, the patient tries to make another person, usually a child, sick, in a similar ploy for attention and support. The cause is not known, but it clearly involves problems with dependency. People like Merle have a pathological need to be needed, and their identities revolve around being seen as nurturers and helpers. Having a sick or injured child allows them to display this aspect of themselves. They live for the concerned glances, hugs of support, and medical attention they get when the child is hospitalized. Often they attract partners who are extremely passive and whose own needs for care and direction are met by being with someone who has such a strong desire for control and utility. Merle's husband fit that description perfectly. What people with MBPS cannot cope with is a child's maturation and the decreased neediness and increased independence that goes along with it. Often, they solve this problem by having or adopting additional, younger or sicker children, but in Merle's case, she seemed to have a specific need for James in particular to be ill. And his resistance and running away, which was not getting her the attention and support from professionals she thought she'd get, became increasingly threatening to her. Since a mother whose young child has died is the ultimate object of sympathy, and since James's behavior could expose her and lead to her losing custody of her other children, his life was increasingly in jeopardy. Mothers with Munchausen's by proxy are extremely dangerous. They may succeed in killing several children before they are caught because the very idea of a mother killing a child is so monstrous. The sympathy for parents who have lost children is also so natural and automatic that the deaths are often not thoroughly investigated. In many cases, the children are killed in infancy and their demise ascribed to sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. In fact, the research paper originally used to claim that SIDS has a genetic origin was based primarily on the case of a mother who had supposedly lost 5 successive children to SIDS. It turned out that the mother had MBPS and had smothered the children to death. She was ultimately convicted of the murders. One of the earliest studies of Munchausen's by proxy involved covertly videotaping mothers suspected of having the condition. 39 mothers with MBPS were caught on tape. Some tampered with life support machines, some smothered their babies with pillows, and one even forced her fingers down her infant's throat. 12 siblings of these children were found to have died suddenly and, when confronted with the videotapes, 4 of the mothers confessed to having killed 8 of the babies. Unfortunately, increased attention to the disorder has also led to wrongful prosecutions of women whose children genuinely did die of SIDS. because, thankfully, both multiple SIDS deaths in one family and Munchausen's by proxy are exceptionally rare, the limited data available has made distinguishing between the two causes of death tricky. The British pediatrician who originally named the syndrome, Roy Meadow, devised the basis of what became known as Meadow's Law regarding infant deaths. 1 sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder until proved otherwise. Recently, however, he lost his medical license after his expert testimony on the foundations of his law turned out not to be supported by the data. The convictions of numerous women based on this law are being revisited, although Meadow's license has now been returned. At least 3 convictions have already been overturned. The Meadow debacle has led some to doubt even the existence of Munchausen's as a specific form of child abuse, but there are clear cases like Merle's and like those of the parents in the videotapes who deliberately harm their children in order to get support and medical attention. Around 9% of children born to women with this disorder die at their hands, and many more suffer serious injuries and are subjected to hundreds of unneeded and painful medical procedures. Unfortunately, because so little is known about its cause, there are very few clues to diagnosing it. Few males have MBPS, and MBPS may be overrepresented in women who work in the healthcare field. Many seem to have suffered childhood trauma or abused themselves, often severe neglect, but the overwhelming majority of women who work in healthcare or who were victims of childhood trauma never develop this condition. It may be on the pathological end of a spectrum of healthy behaviors stemming from a desire to nurture others and be valued for it, a case of too much of a good thing. The same dependency may drive other people to extreme acts of caring and altruism. How some slip from desperately wanting to help others into feeling compelled to hurt them so that help will always be needed, I cannot say. Thankfully, the judge took our advice and, on an emergency basis, removed James and his siblings from the custody of Merle and her husband. A civil jury later agreed that James had been abused by his adoptive mother and that the father had not intervened to prevent it. Evidence was presented that proved how James's mother had twisted his words and actions to portray him as a troubled child and hide her own depravity. The couple's parental rights in relation to all 5 children, including their 1 biological child, were terminated, and criminal child abuse charges were also filed against them. I hear occasionally from the prosecutor in the case, who has stayed in touch with James and his new adoptive parents. His name has been changed and, last I heard, he was thriving in his new life. His disruptive behavior and running away was entirely a product of his attempt to get help. I believe he saved not only his own life, but those of his siblings as well. His story reminds me to trust my gut and always keep listening to the child, no matter what other therapists, official reports, and even parents may say. Chapter 10. The Kindness of Children. I watched them for a few moments before I walked into the waiting room. The boy's behavior had an innocent sweetness to it. I could see him smiling, crawling into his mother's lap, squirming so that he could sit face to face with her. Then, he tenderly reached his hand up to her mouth and touched her, playful, exploring. The quiet interaction between the two was classic bonding behavior between a mother and an infant, even a toddler. But Peter was 7. As I watched them, I could tell that mother and child had frequently engaged in this gentle, soothing game. When I walked in, I also noticed that Amy Asterisk, the mom, was embarrassed by it. Her husband, Jason, Asterisk Peter's father, seemed even more ashamed when I appeared to have caught them. "Sit up, Peter," Jason said as he stood up and shook my hand. I walked over to the boy, stood over him, looked down and smiled. "Hi, Peter." I put my hand out. Peter reached up to touch my hand. "Peter, stand up and shake Dr. Perry's hand," Jason said. Amy tried to push Peter off her lap to his feet. Peter went limp and laughed. It seemed like part of their game. "Peter, stand up," Jason said again, his voice patient but firm. I could feel his frustration and exhaustion. I knew they had their hands full. "That's okay. You guys just get comfortable. I just wanted to see how you think things went today." I sat down across from them. "This first visit is really just to give Peter a chance to come and meet some of us and start to get familiar with us. Hopefully, you had some fun today." Peter nodded. "Use words, honey," Amy said. Peter sat up and said, "Yes." The family had just spent 3 hours in our clinic for an intake appointment. They had come to see us because Peter had a long history of speech and language problems, as well as difficulties with attention and impulsivity. Not surprisingly, he also had social and academic problems in school. Occasionally, he had bizarre and ferocious outbursts in which he seemed to completely lose control. They were terrifying and, unlike ordinary temper tantrums, could last for hours. Peter's parents had adopted him from a Russian orphanage when he was 3 years old. They had immediately fallen in love with the blonde, blue-eyed boy with rosy cheeks who looked like a little angel. The operators of the orphanage had proudly shown off how well-fed he was and how clean their facility was, but, in truth, Peter and the other children who lived there had been profoundly neglected. Amy and Jason had heard about our work with maltreated children from other adoptive parents. We were at the end of the first day of a 2-day consultation visit at our clinic. The family had traveled over 500 miles for the evaluation. "So, Peter, will you come back and visit us tomorrow?" I asked. "Yes," he said with a big smile. Our clinicians had a lot of work to do before then. During a typical evaluation, our interdisciplinary group of psychologists, social workers, child psychiatry fellows, and child psychiatrists usually spread multiple visits out over a few weeks to get to know a child and his family. In Peter's case, the process was condensed because he lived so far away. Records from the schools, the child's pediatrician, previous mental health providers, and other professionals were available to review, process, and integrate into our impressions of the child and family. We also did a brain scan, an MRI, as part of a study we were working on to see how early neglect affected the brain. The data from our research has shown that significant early life neglect such as that seen in formerly institutionalized children like Peter leads to smaller brain size overall, brain shrinkage in certain regions, and a host of brain-related functional problems. By finding which areas were most affected in Peter's case, we hope to target our treatments to maximal effect. During the evaluation period, sometimes as many as a dozen staff members would meet to talk about what we were seeing and experiencing with this child. It was a process designed to identify the child's strengths and vulnerabilities and carefully determine his current developmental stage in a host of domains, from perceptual abilities to motor skills, from emotional, cognitive, and behavioral abilities to moral sentiments. This enabled us to come to a preliminary diagnosis and make our initial recommendations for intervention. Although it would be too time-consuming and expensive to replicate in many settings, we hope to develop models of care based on this process that would be less staff-intensive. At the time we began working with Peter and his family, we'd made good progress on our neurosequential approach to maltreated children. We'd recognized that victims of early trauma and neglect need experiences, such as rocking and being held, appropriate for the age at which they'd suffered damage or deprivation, not for their chronological age. We'd found that these developmentally appropriate enrichment and therapeutic experiences had to be provided repeatedly and consistently in a respectful and caring manner. Coercive, punitive, and forceful delivery only made things worse. We'd also started to incorporate music, dance, and massage in order to stimulate and organize the lower brain regions, which contain the key regulatory neurotransmitter systems involved in the stress response. As we've seen, these areas are more likely to be affected by early trauma because they undergo important, fast-paced development early in life. Finally, we'd begun to use medications to help children with troublesome dissociative or hyperarousal symptoms. But while we had realized that ongoing relationships are critical to healing, we hadn't yet fully understood how important peer relationships are, especially as children get older. The details of Peter's past brought the critical role of relationships into vivid focus for me. Peter had been raised without adult attention for the first 3 years of his life. He'd been kept in what was basically a baby warehouse. A big, bright room with 60 infants in seemingly endless, straight rows of perfectly sanitized cribs. The 2 caretakers on duty for each shift would work methodically from one bed to the next, feeding each child, changing his or her diaper, then moving on. That was all the individual adult attention the babies received. Roughly 15 minutes each per 8-hour shift. The infants were rarely spoken to or held other than. During these brief intervals, they were not rocked or cradled or cooed at because there simply wasn't time for staff to do more than feed and change, feed and change. Even the toddlers spent their days and nights caged in their cribs. With no one but each other to turn to, The children would reach their tiny hands through the bars into the next crib, holding hands, babbling and playing patty cake. In the absence of adults, they became parents to each other. Their interaction, as impoverished as it was, probably helped to mitigate some of the damage such severe deprivation can cause. When Peter's adoptive parents first brought him home, they discovered that he was trying to communicate with them. Delighted, they sought a Russian translator. But the Russian translator said his speech wasn't Russian. Perhaps the orphanage workers had been immigrants from elsewhere in Eastern Europe who had taught the children to speak their native tongue. A Czech speaker said it wasn't Czech, however, and soon Amy and Jason learned that Peter wasn't speaking Hungarian or Polish either. To their surprise, they found that the words Peter spoke didn't belong to any known language. Apparently, the orphans had developed their own rudimentary language, like the private speech of twins or the improvised signing of deaf children raised together. Like King Psamtik of Egypt, who, according to Herodotus, isolated two children to learn what language they would naturally speak without the opportunity to learn from people around them. The operators of the orphanage had created a harsh and accidental experiment in linguistics. On their own, the children had apparently created and agreed upon several dozen words. One word the translators were able to figure out was that mum meant adult or caregiver, just as similar sounds mean mother in almost every known human language, since the sound is the first one babies learn to make while suckling. In our clinical meeting, my team and I went over everything we knew about the boy's early history, including his limited exposure to adults and his linguistic deprivation. We also discussed his adoptive parents. My initial impression of Amy and Jason was confirmed by the rest of the staff. Everyone agreed that they were remarkable. Even before they'd adopted Peter, they had read parenting books, watched parenting videos, and talked extensively with their pediatrician about what to expect when adopting a child like him. After they brought Peter home, they worked with speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and mental health providers to help Peter catch up. They followed the advice they were given diligently. They spent money, time, and energy trying to give Peter what he needed to grow up healthy, happy, productive, and compassionate. Yet, despite all of their best efforts, and the efforts of the dozens of specialists, Peter continued to struggle. He had improved dramatically in many regards, but his progress was spotty, slow, and incremental. He would learn new skills only after hundreds of repetitions, not dozens like other children. He learned English, but his enunciation was strange and his grammar was mangled. His movements were also uncoordinated, and even when he tried to sit still, he would sway. Also, he would rarely establish or maintain eye contact appropriately. At 7, he still had several primitive self-soothing behaviors, primarily rocking and sucking his thumb. He would sniff extensively at everything that he ate before putting it into his mouth, and also tried noticeably to catch the scent of people whenever he met them. He was easily distracted and often laughed and smiled to himself, giving the impression that he was in his own little world. And in the last year he seemed to have hit a developmental plateau, and perhaps even regressed a bit. We first discussed Peter's strengths, starting with his friendly, almost goofy manner. He was also well above average in some aspects of language and seemed to have some mathematical talents. He was extremely nurturing, but in a blatantly immature fashion, responding to peers and adults the way a toddler might. It became clear through our discussions that while Peter was in some ways cognitively 7, in other domains he acted much younger. Confirming our observations regarding the use-dependent nature of brain development, the areas where he was doing better were related to brain regions that had received stimulation, and those where he had deficits represented brain regions that had either been more severely deprived or had not yet received enough stimulation to make up for the earlier neglect. The scans of his brain reinforced our observations of this fractured neurodevelopment. He had cortical atrophy, large ventricles, which meant that spinal fluid was taking up space that would normally have been occupied by brain tissue, and lower brain structures that were small for his age and likely underdeveloped. Such splintered development is common in children who grow up in chaotic or neglectful environments. It causes tremendous confusion for parents, teachers, and peers. From the outside, Peter looked like a 7-year-old boy, but in some ways he was only a 3-year-old. In terms of other skills and capabilities, he was 18 months old, and he was 8 or 9 years old in still other respects. This inconsistency was a major source of the family's problems. There were also important differences in the way each parent interacted with Peter. When he was home and alone with Amy, she was extremely attuned to his needs. If he acted like a baby, she would engage him at that age level, and if he acted like an older child, she would interact with him that way. I believe that her intuitive capacity to meet his developmental needs was the primary reason he had made as much progress as he had. But as Peter got older, Jason began to question some of Amy's babying of the boy. This caused tension in the marriage, with Jason arguing that Amy was responsible for Peter's lack of progress because she was smothering him, while Amy insisted that he needed the extra affection because of his past. Such differences are an almost universal feature of parenting. However, when disagreements are profound as they were becoming in Amy and Jason's case, they can lead to serious marital problems. I had seen the conflict in my brief interaction with the family in the waiting room. Part of my job would be to help the couple understand Peter's needs and explain to them how it was necessary to meet him where he was developmentally. That way, they would be able to learn to avoid overwhelming Peter and frustrating themselves by requiring age-appropriate behavior in a domain for which he did not yet have the capacity. When the family came in for the second day of the evaluation, we gave Peter some formal psychological tests. Later, we observed more parent/child interactions and sent the boy off for another play break. Finally, it was time to tell the parents what we thought about Peter's case and what we proposed to do to help him. I could see that Amy and Jason were anxious as soon as I walked into the room. "What do you think?" Jason said, clearly wanting to get bad news out of the way. "I think Peter is really a very lucky boy," I began. "You are wonderful parents, and he has shown remarkable progress over the last 4 years." I paused for a moment to let that sink in. Then, I added, "Your efforts are heroic. You must be exhausted." Amy started to cry. Her husband tenderly put his arm around her. I got some tissue and handed it to her. She wiped her eyes. I began to tell them what I thought, asking them to interrupt if I said anything that they thought wasn't accurate or didn't make sense. I related Peter's history as I understood it, recounting the details of the orphanage and the list of developmental delays he had experienced. Then I asked if I was right in suspecting that when Peter became upset, all of his developmental progress would seem to disappear and he would act in primitive, almost frightening ways. Perhaps he'd lie on the floor in the fetal position, moaning and rocking, or perhaps he'd let out unearthly screams. I added that I thought that once he started to get stirred up or overwhelmed, he probably reached a point of no return, and that he seemed to regress before slowly coming back to himself. They nodded. That's when I explained how changes in our emotional state can affect how we learn. Skills that we've mastered, like comprehension of certain concepts or even use of language itself, may dissipate when we get worked up. I talked about how new or frightening situations would be stressful to a child like Peter and would likely prompt this kind of regression. Wrapping up what we'd learned from the evaluation, I said, "So, I think we have a pretty good idea about Peter's problems and how he ended up with them. We also know some of his strengths, not all, but some. The key now is whether we can use what we know to help him." I paused, struggling to strike a balance between hope and caution. "Let me take a moment and talk with you about how the brain develops," I began. "I think if you understand this a little bit more, you will feel better about the progress that Peter has made, and I think you will better understand why progress now seems so slow." As I spoke, my thoughts about the theory and practice I'd been working on for so many years seemed to crystallize for the first time as a coherent whole. I drew several charts on a blank piece of paper. The first, see Appendix Figure 1, showed a simple comparison of the growth of the brain relative to the growth of the rest of the body, making the point that while the body doesn't reach its adult height and weight until adolescence, the brain's growth follows a much different path. By age 3, it has reached 85% of its full adult size. The human brain grows most rapidly early in life, I explained. In fact, the majority of brain growth takes place in the first 3 years of life. I wanted to help them understand the full significance of the fact that Peter had been in a sterile, neglectful institution during that critical period when the brain is rapidly organizing itself. Then I drew a pyramid and turned the page upside down. See Appendix, Figure 2. The brain is organized from the bottom to the top, I said. The top part here, I noted as I pointed to the wide base of the upside-down pyramid, is the cortex, the most complex part of the brain. responsible for our ability to think and for integrating many of our functions. I also described how some of the lower regions work, how the central emotional areas allow us to make social connections and control our stress, and how the core brainstem areas drive the stress response itself. I explained how these regions awaken sequentially during development, starting from the innermost brainstem and moving out toward the cortex as the child grows. I discussed how the development of higher, more complex brain regions relies on proper organization of the lower, simpler areas. I explained how deprivation could affect these regions and cause the wide variations in their son's behavior. The key is to parent Peter where he is developmentally, not where he is chronologically, I said. Jason nodded, beginning to understand what I was saying. Which is a very difficult thing to do, right? Now both parents nodded. The challenge is that, in one moment, you will need to have expectations and provide experiences that are appropriate for a 5-year-old, for example, when you are teaching him a specific cognitive concept. 10 minutes later, however, the expectation and challenges will have to match those for a younger child, for example, when you are trying to teach him to interact socially. He is, developmentally, a moving target. This is why parenting these children is such a frustrating experience. One moment you are doing the correct thing and the next you are out of sync. Amy and Jason had experienced this dichotomy many times, but until this conversation they hadn't been able to articulate it. My explanations helped them enormously, immediately reducing their conflict over babying Peter and helping Jason not worry when his wife engaged in it. Now, in fact, he could allow himself to do it as well. Amy, however, could also see from what we taught her that there were times when Jason's more demanding parenting style would be useful. But explanations alone would not be enough. The core challenges of parenting Peter would remain the same, and it would be close to impossible for either parent to be attuned to him always or even most of the time without more support. Both parents were spent emotionally and physically. We would need to help them get some respite care. We suggested bolstering their social network, taking time for themselves as a couple and doing things they enjoyed so that they could recharge their batteries for their time with Peter. Amy and Jason were open to all of our suggestions. Since they did not live near our clinic, we had to work with and through their local providers. Fortunately, most of the pieces of a good clinical team were in place. Peter had an excellent speech therapist, occupational therapist, master's level therapist, and an understanding pediatrician. We had talked with all of them. We wanted to add therapeutic massage and a music and movement class to his routine, which had been useful for other children who suffered early neglect, such as Connor. But what I thought at first would be just another piece of the puzzle turned out to be the most important element. Peter's school and, especially, his classmates. As I looked over his history, I suddenly recognized that most of Peter's progress had come in the first 3 years after he came to the United States, when he spent his time alone with his parents or with adults or 1 or 2 peers selected by them. When he began attending kindergarten, however, his progress had ceased and his behavior problems had intensified. His mother had intuitively understood that he was chronologically 6 but behaviorally 2, but his classmates couldn't comprehend why he behaved so strangely. Even his teacher didn't know how to handle him, despite having been told of his background. Peter would grab toys from other children without asking, missing the social cues the other kindergartners understood about when it was okay to take something and when it wasn't. He didn't understand when he should share his things and when to keep them to himself, when he should speak and when he should be quiet. At circle time, he'd suddenly get up and slip into the teacher's lap or begin to wander around without realizing he wasn't supposed to. And he'd sometimes shriek and have his terrifying tantrums. As a result, the other children began to fear and marginalize him. His oddly accented English didn't help. His classmates viewed him as a strange and frightening boy. He'd done well in the sheltered world of his adoptive home, with one-on-one relationships with adults who knew and loved him. But the complex social world of kindergarten, with its varying peer and teacher relationships to negotiate, was beyond him. Instead of the patient, nurturing, loving responses he got at home, at kindergarten his behavior was met with suspicion and, often, outright rejection. The classroom filled with noisy children and loud toys and frequent movement was overwhelming to him. Where once he understood what was expected of him and was treated gently if he wasn't able to do it, now he couldn't figure out what was going on. No matter how many hours of healthy positive experiences Peter had each week, The hours when he was marginalized or teased could easily overshadow them. Peter had no real friends and preferred to play with much younger children. He felt most comfortable with 3- or 4-year-olds. His own classmates didn't know what to make of the boy who talked funny and often acted like a baby. In many situations, children can be kind and nurturing to someone who appears to be younger and more vulnerable. But Peter frightened them. The behavior of his classmates was predictable. What was happening was a small version of what happens all across the planet in various forms every day. Human beings fear what they don't understand. The unknown scares us. When we meet people who look or act in unfamiliar or strange ways, our initial response is to keep them at arm's length. At times we make ourselves feel superior, smarter, or more competent by dehumanizing or degrading those who are different. The roots of so many of our species' ugliest behaviors, racism, ageism, misogyny, antisemitism, to name just a few, are in this basic brain-mediated response to perceived threat. We tend to fear what we do not understand, and fear can so easily twist into hate or even violence because it can suppress the rational parts of our brain. Faced with Peter's growing ostracism and social rejection, Amy and Jason wanted to know what to do. Should they hold him back in kindergarten, hoping he'd learn more socially the second time around? Yet his cognitive abilities were clearly on grade level for first grade, perhaps higher. Peter was intellectually advanced, but socially clueless. I realized that if he was going to catch up, he was going to need the help of his peers. It seemed to me that we might as well try letting him start first grade. When I had worked with adolescents, some of them had allowed me to talk with their classmates about their traumatic experiences and the effect it had on their brain. A bit of understanding had gone a long way in helping improve their social lives. But could this work with first graders? And would Peter find it acceptable? I knew that I would be in his hometown several weeks after his evaluation and could talk to his classmates at that time. I went back to explore this possibility with Peter. As we were coloring, I asked, "Peter, do you remember living in Russia?" He stopped and looked at me for a moment. I kept slowly coloring, not looking back at him. The pace of his coloring slowed. I was just about to ask again when he took a new sheet of paper and drew a big blue circle around the entire page. "This is Russia." He held the page up to me. He placed the paper back on the floor, took a color and made one tiny, delicate, almost invisible dot. "And this is Peter." I looked at him. He was clearly sad. He was eloquently expressing how he felt at the orphanage, where he'd been special to no one, just one of dozens of anonymous babies. I smiled sympathetically at him, then raised my eyebrows and said, "But that isn't Peter anymore, is it?" He shook his head no and smiled back. "Peter, I was thinking that I would come to your first grade class to visit. I wasn't sure he would understand, but I wanted him to know what I wanted to do and why." "Okowo. You know how we have talked about how your brain is growing and changing? I was wondering if you would mind if I talked to your class about the brain. And maybe a little about the way you lived before you came to live with your parents." "Okay," he said thoughtfully, adding, "Will you bring the pictures?" "Which pictures?" "The pictures of my brain." "Sure. You won't mind if I show pictures of your brain to your class?" "No. My brain is cool. You know, Peter, you are so right. Your brain is cool." And so, with his permission and with that of his parents and his school, I decided to see if I could make first graders into a new community of therapists for Peter. I addressed his first grade class at the beginning of the school year. "I'm Peter's friend," I said. "I study the brain and Peter asked me to come from Houston to tell you some of the things about the brain that I taught him." I had Peter come up to the front of the class and serve as my assistant. I told the first graders about the brain and about how in some ways it acts like a muscle. I talked about how they were exercising their ABC muscles in school and about the importance of repetition. I described how they had many other similar kinds of muscles in their brains that also needed certain kinds of attention in order to grow big and strong. I talked about how the brain develops and what makes everyone's brain work, emphasizing how the brain changes. "Remember, Peter, when we were talking about how it takes a lot of practice to learn anything new? That is because the brain changes when you use it, use it, use it." I looked at the children and then back at Peter. "Right, Peter?" He smiled and nodded. "And that is why your teacher keeps having you practice writing again and again, and practice your letters again and again and again. I showed some slides. I brought a model of the brain and Peter passed it around. I answered questions. What part of the brain makes you talk? What color is the brain? Does the brain keep videos of your life? I told the children how important it was for a developing baby's brain to get stimulation from talk and touch and human interactions. I told them the same things that I told parents, judges, pediatricians, and my own staff, just with fewer big words. Then I talked a little bit about how different children grow up in different homes, how Japanese children learn Japanese, how in some cultures mothers carry their babies around all day long during their first year of life, how some children don't get as much touch or talk or love early in life, and how that can change the brain. They were having fun. We laughed. Peter was smiling. Then it was time. I didn't know how much I would say, or even what I would say. I would let the response of the children and Peter guide me. I jumped in. Well, thank you for letting me come to your classroom. Peter told me about you guys when he came to visit me in Houston. I know he went to kindergarten with many of you. A few of the children raised their hands. We asked Peter to come to our clinic in Houston because we wanted to learn from him about his amazing brain. The children looked at Peter. See, when he was a little boy, he spent every minute of every day for the first 3 years of his life in one crib. The children looked interested but kind of confused. Peter was born in another country where they did not know very much about the brain. His parents could not take care of him, so Peter went to an orphanage when he was just a baby. In this orphanage, each baby was put in a crib and that was their home. They didn't get to wander around, crawl anywhere, or even practice standing so they could learn to walk. Until his parents came to get him when he was 3, Peter never had a chance to walk around, to play with friends, to get a hug from any loving grown-ups. His brain didn't get very much stimulation. The room was completely silent. 26 6-year-old children didn't move, speak, or fidget. And then when he was 3, his new parents came and brought him to live in Tulsa. I paused to let some of the tension dissipate. And that is when Peter's amazing brain started to learn so many things. Even though he had never heard English, he learned English in just a couple years. He had never had a chance to walk or run or skip, and he learned to do all of those things. Peter looked embarrassed. I didn't want to push too much. And so even today, Peter's amazing brain is learning. He has really done great. And that is why we wanted to meet Peter and learn more about how any person with such a hard start in life could do so well. Then I ended with, part of what we learned is that every day in school, Peter learns things from all of you. He watches how you do things, he learns from playing with each of you, and he learns from just being your friend. So thank you for helping Peter. And thanks for letting me come and talk about the brain. It was a short and simple talk. I tried to take an unknown Peter and make him less frightening to these children. And over time, their natural goodness emerged. No longer an odd and scary boy, Peter became popular. So popular, in fact, that his peers would argue over who got to sit next to him, who got to be his partner, who got to be in his group. The brightest and strongest children in his class took a special interest in him, and their leadership made all the difference. They included him, protected him, and, ultimately, provided therapeutic experiences that helped Peter catch up. They were tolerant of his developmental problems, patient in correcting his social mistakes, and nurturing in their interactions. These children provided many more positive therapeutic experiences than we ever could have given Peter. Children, just like us adults, react badly to the unknown, to the strange and unfamiliar, especially when they themselves are trying to adjust to a new situation like the start of a school year. Although their social hierarchies aren't always so easy to influence, most bullying and social rejection begins with fear of the unfamiliar, and adults have much more influence over the process than they may believe. When children understand why someone behaves oddly, they give him or her more slack generally. And the younger the children are, the more easily they are influenced by both obvious and subtle cues of rejection and acceptance from adults. These cues often set the tone for the children's status systems, and teachers and parents can either minimize bullying or, unfortunately, maximize it by either strongly discouraging or tolerating the scapegoating of those who are different. Knowing that Peter's immature behavior came from his history of deprivation helped his classmates reinterpret it. When he grabbed something or talked out of turn, They no longer saw it as a personal affront or jarring oddity, but simply as a remnant from his past that they'd been taught to expect. The results were rapid. Almost immediately he stopped having tantrums and outbursts, probably because what had prompted them was frustration, a sense of rejection and feeling misunderstood. Because the other children were more forgiving and more explicit about the social cues they were giving him, he was able to read them better and thus able to fit in better. What had been a downward spiral of rejection, confusion, and frustration became instead a cascade of positive reinforcement, which fed on itself. The huge gaps in developmental age across emotional, social, motor, and cognitive domains slowly filled in. By the time Peter reached high school, he no longer stood out, and he has continued to do well, both academically and socially. His peers and his family healed him by creating a rich social world, a nurturing community. While the neurosequential approach helped us provide the specific stimuli his brain had lacked, massage offering the physical affection that he'd missed, and music and movement to help restore his brain and bodily rhythms, none of that would have been enough without Amy and Jason's love and sensitivity, and without the patience and support of his classmates. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love.